Okay, so let's go ahead and start this evening's class on these chapters of Shantideva with the recitations before the teachings, the prayers. Page 1 is where we'll start with the homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, which we'll do 3 times in the English there. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering. We'll just do this in English. And then after that, go on to refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching, which we'll do once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gipe sunam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, you can set the prayers aside then till the end of class when we do the dedication. And let's just do a short meditation together. Allow ourselves a bit of time to focus the mind. No doubt we've all had busy days, and it's good to spend a little bit of time in meditation before we begin. So we'll just do a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath. And I'm sure you all have a technique that you use with the breath. You can do that in silence for the next few minutes. And then after that, I will lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for this teaching. So I've got my little chime here today, so I'll see if this works and get the sound of that coming through. So. So now let's set our motivation together for this class. And of course, we're studying this masterful text that gives us insight into the path that we have to follow, the perfections that we need to engage in, the way to train our own minds so that we can eventually help all beings. So it's very important that we have that motivation that is in line with this Mahayana text. And that's the motivation, of course, of bodhicitta. So think about, first of all, the incredible opportunity we have in this life to work with this mind, to have met with the teachings that give us the instruction about how to develop this altruistic intention, how to follow these teachings. Feel great joy that you have met with this. We look at our world and we see the rarity of this in our world. It's really quite unique to have this opportunity to study the Dharma in this way, to practice it, to use our lives meaningfully. But then to recognize, as Master Shantideva said in the first several verses of this text, that we have to be very conscientious in keeping this mind active and very much a part of our lives. For if we were to allow it to degenerate, to fall to the lower motivation of simply seeking our own liberation, or even perhaps falling off the Buddhist path entirely, then there are grave consequences to that. Everything that we've lined up in this life to give us this amazing opportunity will fall away, and we may not meet with this opportunity again for quite some time. So it's very important that we become familiar with this mind of bodhicitta and cultivate it as frequently as we can. So take a moment now to recall some of the steps in cultivating that. Certainly to try to see all sentient beings as being very dear, remembering the kindness that they've shown us when they were our mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, as well as just the general kindness that beings show to us that we benefit from. And then the wish to repay this kindness, thinking that it is now our time to make sure that others are cared for in the way that they have cared for us. And we will do this in the best possible way, motivated by a sincere love that not only wants them to be happy, but is dedicated to placing them in happiness, and a compassion that is not only concerned about the suffering of others, but is willing to take on whatever tasks we need to do to protect others from suffering. We then generate that altruistic intention, that sincere desire to accomplish this for the welfare of all beings, even if we have to do this by ourselves alone. And on the basis of that, we then come to the question of how do we possibly accomplish that? How can I free all sentient beings from suffering? Place all of them in happiness. Only by becoming a Buddha. Only when my mind is fully ripened and I've achieved that state will I then have all the qualities necessary to accomplish that task. So it's for this purpose that we're going to study this text tonight, continue our investigation into how we maintain this conscientiousness, this carefulness in our practice, so that we can use these instructions as a way to accomplish that goal, to become a Buddha as quickly as possible, so we can then lead others to that same state. Okay. Was that too loud? Okay. Anyway, so thank you all for joining tonight. So we're going to continue with our study. We're looking at chapters 4 and 5 in this course, Mastering the Mind. Again, we're in chapter 4, mostly working with the teachings on conscientiousness. There are other names for this, like heedfulness, carefulness, the idea being that we do have to be very attentive and alert. Sometimes I use the example of if you were walking on one of these mountain passes and you were on a very, very narrow path. And to the one side, of course, is the mountain, the side of the mountain, but to the other side is a huge precipice that you could fall into at any moment. Well, we know what type of heedfulness we'd have there, because if our very lives depended on it, we would be quite attentive, making sure that every step that we placed was on solid ground, that we didn't have the possibility of falling off and plummeting to our death. So this is the type of heedfulness that, of course, we want to be able to have in our spiritual path, is to be that attentive so that we make sure that, first of all, we don't allow our bodhicitta to wane. And that was the first part of this course, or this chapter 4, was to look at that idea of not allowing bodhicitta to diminish in any way. But then also that we have that same kind of conscientiousness with regard to the trainings. So let me go to the slides and get everyone grounded in where we are in terms of this text right now. So let's see. Recall that this chapter is essentially, divided into 3 parts. The first and the last parts are really just one. The short explanation of this topic and the explanation is from verses 2 all the way through 47. Then there's a summary that'll be the final verse of this chapter. So as I said, this is divided into 2 main parts. The middle section, that is the extensive explanation, meditating on conscientiousness for bodhicitta so that we don't allow that to wane, and then being conscientious in the trainings. Being conscientious in the trainings, we dealt with the first topic last week, conscientiously abandoning faults, to make sure that we don't commit any of the misdeeds, which would be kind of causing us to take rebirth in the lower realms, to lose the good fortune that we have, and to not meet with these circumstances again. And then tonight, we did touch on the first verse of this section last week, I believe, but we're going to continue that section and no doubt finish it. The second one, conscientiously meditating on virtue. And this is, of course, how we accomplish a favorable, a beneficial state, how we stay dedicated to doing that by purifying our negativities, by also, engaging in more virtuous deeds so that we can assure that we've got that continuity of good rebirths. But the third one is what we'll get to as well tonight, I'm sure, conscientiously abandoning the afflictions. And this is a larger section, almost about 20 verses that go into how we work with the afflictions. And of course, for bodhisattvas, they may look at these teachings, and because bodhisattvas are intent upon attaining enlightenment, and the main obstacle to enlightenment are what are called the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to omniscience. But prior to that, the bodhisattva has to remove what are called the afflictive obscurations, which are ignorance, the attachment, anger, hatred, and so on. All of the afflictions, as well as their seeds, have to be completely removed. And so some people who are on the Mahayana path may think, well, I'm just aiming for removing the knowledge obscurations. The knowledge obscurations are the imprints from that ignorance that cause a dualistic appearance. It cause things outside and as well as within our mind, thoughts and what have you, to appear as if they have substantial existence, to kind of have that dualistic quality. And so eventually that has to be removed. And when that is removed, we attain the omniscient state, Buddhahood. So the bodhisattva's main target is to remove the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to that state of omniscience. But in order to accomplish that, we have to work on our own afflictions first. We have to diminish them, decrease them, and eventually eliminate them before we can go on to attaining that state. So by no means does the bodhisattva just, neglect the afflictions. The afflictions are the enemy for the bodhisattva as well, because they keep the bodhisattva from progressing through the path all the way to enlightenment. So we'll touch on this here and there, but that's kind of the background for where we are in terms of this text right now. Go back to the slides. The 3 outlines were in this section on meditating on virtue. I think I introduced these last week as well, but let's go through the first one. Sometimes the outlines are too long for me to put them all on one screen, so I'm going to keep at the top there again, consciously meditating virtue. Its first outline in this Gyaltsab Je's commentary, which you should have in front of you, says, it is the infinite non-virtue accumulated previously. So this is what we looked at last week, verse 21, that kind of shows that we do have to be concerned about the negativities that we've created. And that's because, as it says here in this verse, if even by the negativity committed for an instant, one will abide in relentless torment for eons, then because of the negativities I have accumulated in beginningless psychic existence, what need to mention my not going to a good migration? So this is the idea that if we can commit negativities so easily If the reality is that we will, in an instant potentially, by taking the life of a being, and even what we might think of as an insignificant life, the life of an insect or what have you. If we take that life in a very intentional way, with that motivation to kill, with all the delusions there that fuel it, with a completion of that act, and maybe even a rejoicing at the end of that act, well, then we've created a very powerful karma in the single instant that it takes to swat a mosquito or whatever the case might be. So we can create that, and that can lead us to rebirths as serious as the hell of unrelenting torment, which is said to be the worst hell of the 8 hell realms, the 8 hot hell realms. So again, this isn't, as I mentioned previously, these are kind of stick teachings. These aren't the carrot teachings. These are ways of trying to get across to us that we do have ramifications of our actions that can be very unfortunate for us, that can cause great suffering. So what we have to do is always be attentive to that. And in that verse, it was simply saying that if this is the case for any of these smaller acts that we could commit in a single moment, well then, because we've been around in cyclic existence since beginningless time, we must have created a large quantity of these negative actions. Therefore, we have to make sure we have a force in the opposite direction. This is again the section on dedicating ourselves to virtue and being conscientious and practicing that. And it's even virtuous to purify these negativities. In Gyaltsepje's commentary, that's how he ends his little section on that verse, which is very brief, but he says one should train in purifying negativity by way of the 4 powers. So I think I did touch on these last time as well. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. Most of you know these from your own practice, and hopefully you do a daily practice of purification using the 4 opponent powers. The 2 main practices that we generally use are Vajrasattva meditation, right, with the recitation of Vajrasattva mantra, and the prostrations to the 35 Buddhas. But nonetheless, you can do any sorts of practices as long as you incorporate these 4. The first is regret, having a real remorse for those actions that we know that we've done, that we can bring to mind, as well as actions that we can infer that we've done, or try to include in a more general way. Reliance, which includes regenerating in our mind the idea of refuge, finding safe direction in the 3 jewels, recommitting ourselves to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And then bodhicitta, the mind that kind of determines that once more we're going to be dedicated to the welfare of others, which begins to offset the harmful actions that we've done towards other beings, because now we're generating the most beneficial mind towards them. So refuge and bodhicitta are providing a safe and uh, reliable ground upon which we can purify. They often compare this to the idea that if you fall on the ground, you have to use the ground itself to get up. So the ground of our practice of purification is renewing our faith in the 3 jewels, as well as our dedication to the welfare of all beings. The third of these 4 opponent powers is the remedy, the actual act that we engage in, whether it be the recitation of mantra, whether it be reciting a sutra, whether it be doing prostrations, whether it be meditating on compassion or emptiness. We can do many different things, and any virtuous action essentially can be used as a remedy as long as we use it in conjunction with the other opponent powers. The fourth one is the most important, the resolve to restrain, to refrain from those actions again for as best as we can in the future. So when we have a practice like that, that concludes all 4 of these, it can be very effective in diminishing the power of those negative actions, as well as eventually eliminating them so that they don't bring forth any of the results. Again, we'd have to purify repeatedly and quite strongly to get to that result, but even doing this on a daily basis can be very, very effective. So that was what we went through last week. And that was that first outline that had to do with why it's appropriate, to abandon the infinite non-virtues, because we've created them since beginningless time in these many, many instances when we have been to the state of the delusions and so on. The second outline that's on page 15 of Jay's commentary says why a single suffering in the lower realm exhausts that karma, but does not exhaust the karma of the lower realm. And this is because, as Gyaltsepje says, one may think, well, I could end up in the lower realm, sure, from these negative actions, but it's not difficult to become liberated from the lower realms, because after the result is exhausted, I will then take rebirth in the happy migrations. Well, this is what someone may think, But as you know, in many of these opponents that are put forward in the text, it's not correct thinking. So this is what how it is encapsulated in this verse 22. This is the objector saying, or I'm sorry, this is the reply to the objector: through experiencing merely that, I shall not be liberated. You won't be liberated by merely experiencing that lower rebirth, because while experiencing that in such a way, other negativities will be strongly produced. So again, this is this idea that while we are in these negative states, and if we even look at, we have obvious evidence of the animal realm in this world. We don't have direct evidence of the hungry ghost realm, the hell realms, these other realms that the Buddha taught that are unfavorable. But look at the animal realm and see how much negativity animals engage in. And even if we let like our house cats outside, there's danger that they will kill birds, kill insects, kill other beings, rodents, what have you. So we know that these beings have a proclivity as part of their nature to harm other beings generally. Not all animals do. Some animals are quite peaceful, vegetarian, what have you. But many animals in this world, especially the ones that are not our house pets, spend most of their lives trying to kill other beings and trying to do whatever they can in that light to sustain their own lives. So by virtue of them doing that, they're creating negative karma. Now they don't have a strong intention to kill in a very diluted way, but nonetheless it's coming out of their ignorance. It's coming out of that state of mind that an animal has. So if we look at the animal world, we can see it's a given there that beings generally create a lot of negative karma. And in the hell realms, if we read the accounts of the hell realms from the Lam Rim, the hungry ghost realm, we see that there can be certainly many states, many types of existences there that do the same thing. So when we look at those realms, we get evidence that this is what Shantideva is saying here is true, that even though we might end up in an unfortunate state and think, well, we'll just bounce back out into the upper realms. Well, that may happen, but it probably won't, because we will, in that lower rebirth, when we aren't we don't have any dharma around us, we don't have any great thoughts of compassion in our minds, we'll probably harm other beings. So Gyaltsab Je, when he's commenting on this on that page 15 of the commentary, he says, a person will not be liberated from the lower realms merely through experiencing the result of only one negative action. While one is experiencing the suffering result of previous karma, one adventitiously creates other negativity that brings forth powerful suffering. On the basis of the lower realms, virtue is weak and negativity is continuously accumulated. Therefore, one should strive to stop the cause of the lower realms. So again, this is more impetus for us to move away from non-virtue to move towards virtue. Because the more virtuous seeds that we plant, even though no doubt we will still have some non-virtue, more virtuous seeds we plant, the preponderance of those that will be there. And certainly at the end of this life, if we're able to have that activate us to keep us in the upper realms, we will avoid the pitfalls of ending up in the lower realms and getting caught in this whole cycle of going from one unfortunate rebirth to the next. When we studied this in the master's program in the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Knowledge text, there are all the various realms of existence, and they say the preponderance of beings are in the lower realms. The vast quantity of beings. When we look at even this world in terms of the number of animal beings versus the number of human beings, we might think there's a lot of human beings in this world, and there are at nearly 8 billion human beings. But 8 billion is nothing compared to the amount of beings that are in the waters of the ocean, the beings on land in terms of the various insects and birds and all sorts of mammals, what have you. If we compare, and I again, I don't have any statistics for you, but I'm sure we can see that even on the amount of land or area that one of each of us live, there can be many, many, many other beings living there. Ants and other insects, what have you. So it's without a doubt, most beings are under the control, under the sway of these delusions, and end up spending a lot of time in the lower realms. And because they can't create so much virtue there, they get sort of stuck there. But it's not permanently stuck, because we all have seeds of virtue. We all have roots of virtue that we've created at various times when we've come up out of those realms. And so it's really important in this human life that we have, where we have more control over our thoughts, over our speech, over our physical actions, that we actually engage in virtue. So this is what Master Shantideva is encouraging us to do by, first of all, looking at the ramifications of us not doing anything about that and continuing to be under the control of these negative states and committing negative deeds. So let's go on then to the next outline, the third outline. Why then it is appropriate to strive in the antidote to negative. It's important for us to engage in virtue. This has 4 outlines. So the first of these 4 outlines is, if one does not strive in virtue upon having attained a happy migration, then one deceives oneself. This is a somewhat famous verse from this 4th chapter that you may have seen before, but the concept is that if we end up in this human life and we don't take advantage of the opportunity to practice virtue, then we've ripped ourselves off. We've deceived ourselves. We've not done the very bare minimum that we should be doing in this life. Recalling that these are essentially the teachings of the small scope of the Lam Rim, the person of least capacity, at least to use this life to gain a good rebirth. So Master Shantideva says, if having found such leisure, I do not familiarize with virtue, there can be no deception other than this. There can be no confusion other than this, or sometimes they use the words greater than this. We can't deceive ourselves greater than this. There's no greater confusion than this. So Gyaltsab-Je, in his commentary, he says, having found it difficult to find freedom with great meaning, if I do not strive in and meditate on the cause for higher status and liberation, then there is no better method for self-deception. We've done the best job of deceiving ourselves if we don't spend our time meditating on how to get a higher rebirth, have a good state, higher status as it's often called, or to achieve liberation, which includes enlightenment within it. These kind of results of definite goodness that we can actually achieve. Then it says, there is also no greater ignorance than the ignorance concerning what has to be practiced and what has to be abandoned. So if we buy into the confusion that we've been under the control of since beginningless time and continue to simply create the causes for unfortunate rebirths, then we really will not have done what we're here to do. And by virtue of that, we will have damaged ourselves. We will really have not done the best job of tending to ourselves. And it's kind of interesting, His Holiness is always talking about how we can be wisely selfish. Even at this level, this is what it means to be wisely selfish. We generally talk about it in terms of being compassionate towards others and holding them as the object we cherish. But even here, if we are concerned about our own well-being, why do we not engage in the causes of that? Why do we continue to be under the control of that confusion? So there is a little verse that is quoted and referred to in the other commentary that I work from sometimes. It's verse 60 of Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. I thought I would share that with you. I didn't put it on the slides, but this is a translation by Alex Berzin. He says, even more foolish than someone who uses a golden vessel adorned with gems to collect his own vomit is someone who, having been born as a human, performs negative deeds. So, we would be outraged if we had this beautiful vase that we had paid a lot of money for, and someone, used it as like a spittoon or something and vomited in it or what have you. We'd be like, oh my gosh, what have you done to this beautiful vase? Well, it's so much more serious that we've got this human life, and if we don't use it to collect merit and rather only to collect non-virtue, it's like the same thing, except of course so much worse. So anyway, I thought I'd share that verse because it's got an interesting spin on things in terms of looking at this idea of using a vessel in this way. But this is what is first being said of the first of the 4 topics in this section. So let me go ahead and go back to these and we'll continue on. The second outline within this third outline, again, there were 4 outlines within this, says one will experience suffering in this life. So if we don't use this life, if we don't engage in virtue, then we're going to face some consequences, especially at the end of this life. And this is what's in verse 24. Shantideva says, if having understood this, out of confusion, I am indolent afterwards. When it is time to die, tremendous grief will rear its head. So when we reach our deathbed, when we get to that point, we will have great regrets if we have not used this life well. There's a very brief passage in Gyaltsab-Je. He says, should I, this is page 16, should I, after having realized that I have to strive in achieving virtue and abandoning negativity, still be indolent with regard to the mind of enlightenment, the practice of the perfections, and so on, then at the time of death, when I know I'm going to the lower realms, great misery will arise. Therefore, I should strive with great effort. So again, this is just speaking to the very serious consequences in terms of this life, that we will have great regrets at the time of death. The next outline, the third outline of the four, says later one will be beaten down by the sufferings of the lower realm. So our suffering doesn't stop there in terms of the regret we have at the end of this life. We then end up in an unfortunate state. So we're getting a bit more of the stick here. And I don't have to apologize for Shantideva. He's got his purpose in saying this, but just know that we did get the carrot in the first part of this text when we are given all the wonderful things about bodhicitta and this path. But it's important that we recall the ramifications of our not using this life well. Verse 25 says, "If my body burns for a long time in the fires of hell, which are difficult to bear, inevitably my mind will be tormented by the blazing fires of unbearable remorse." So, oops, sorry, didn't want to go to that one. I just wanted to hit the stop share for a second. So this is once more that the remorse that we may have upon recognizing that when we end up in an unfortunate state that we didn't do what we needed to do. Now, I don't know if we actually have that awareness, that consciousness, to be able to recollect at that point that you didn't do the necessary work and therefore you're facing the consequences. But nonetheless, it can be inferred that if we had that awareness at that time, if we saw the unfortunate state that we were projected into at the end of this life through the force of our non-virtue, we would have those great regrets. Sometimes I use really mundane examples, like say you went to Paris. Paris is a beautiful city with many things to see, and you spent your entire 2 weeks in Paris in your hotel room just watching television or something. That would be a real waste of your time, right? You spend all this money and you go to Paris, and you come home and people say, well, did you like Paris? And you say, oh yeah, I really enjoyed my time in the hotel room. Well, you didn't see Paris then. You didn't go to the Louvre. You didn't go to, the Eiffel Tower. You didn't go see all the amazing things that there are to see in Paris. Well, that's just a real mundane example. But think of the remorse that we'll have at the end of this life if we recognize that what we were here to do, to develop our minds further, to engage in virtuous deeds, to practice the Bodhisattva path and avoid all the negativities, if instead we did the exact opposite and all we did was create the results for an unfortunate state, then we would have great regret, great remorse. So I don't know if I need to read Gyaltsab Je's passage on this. It's very brief. So let's go back then to the outlines and take a look at the next one, the fourth one, that is kind of concluding this section of why it's appropriate that we do strive in virtue. The fourth outline is why it is appropriate to abandon negativity and practice virtue on the basis of these preceding thoughts. So there are a couple of outlines within this, but I didn't put them on the slide simply because it gets to be too much to put an outline within an outline within an outline within another outline. It just kind of becomes a little too much. But if you have it in front of you, you'll see that the first part of it is the verses that are in front of you now. And this is essentially called, if one goes to the lower realms after the power of the precious human rebirth is exhausted, then that equals something mindless, I guess is what it's supposed to be. I'm not sure, the English isn't always perfect on this translation. So let's go through what this verse says, these 6 lines. Having found by some coincidence this beneficial state that is so hard to find, if now, while having knowledge, I am once again led into the hells, then, as though I were confused by mantra, this mind will be reduced to nothing. So let's take a look then at what Gyaltsab Je says, recalling, of course, what we looked at last week, which was all of the great qualities of this perfect human rebirth, what are called the 8 freedoms, the 10 endowments. So we now have found this basis, this perfect human rebirth that we can use to unbelievable results. But if based on that we end up in the lower realms, well then it's as if we're confused by some mantra or some drug or something that has caused us to not be aware of who we are and what we're doing. Then the mind's kind of gone. We don't have any force of mind behind all of it, any of that, of course, conscientiousness that we're talking about. So Gyaltsab Je says, the basis of benefit the precious human rebirth with freedoms and endowments, again, that we looked at last time, is extremely difficult to find, and if found, is of great purpose. So again, we talked about the difficulty of finding it too. Remember at the very last verse of that section, there was the turtle that comes up from the bottom of the ocean every 100 years and is blind, and it has to stick its nose through a golden yolk that is floating on the ocean, on the surface. And so this is the rarity of gaining all these qualities lined up perfectly, this human existence with everything that we need to practice well. So it also has great purpose. We can use this life to accomplish temporal purpose, to get a good rebirth. We can use it for the more lasting purposes of certain goodness, definite goodness, which are liberation and enlightenment, where once we attain that state, there will be no changing in that. Whereas, of course, if we simply use it for a higher rebirth, we may not be able to sustain good higher rebirths, But if we attain liberation or enlightenment on the basis of this body, that will be using it to its greatest benefit. So Gyaltsab continues and he says, having found it somehow, again, it's not just somehow that it was by chance. We talked about this as well, I believe, that the main causes of our gaining a good rebirth are our practice of virtue. Good morality is the main cause for getting a good rebirth, a human rebirth in particular. The second cause is having practiced generosity and to some extent the other perfections, because we all have resources in our life right now. We're all well fed and taken care of. We have roofs over our head and so on. That's because we practiced generosity in the past. And it's good to have a human rebirth where we have those things in our life. Not so that we're more comfortable and can enjoy those solely, but rather that by having those, we can benefit others and we can turn our mind towards the Dharma so much more easily. And then, of course, having the third cause is to have, created the causes through our own stainless prayers, having made prayers that are with the most pure motivation, the highest motivation of bodhicitta, that we want to achieve this good rebirth and meet with the Dharma and so on. So it's important that we attend to all three of those. The main one we're talking about here is morality, practicing good behavior. So he says again, as I just was reading, having found it somehow, should I again go to the lower realms, despite having knowledge of what is useful and what is harmful, then that makes me someone without a mind, achieving just the purpose of the moment for self, similarly to a person confused by mantra, or again, confused by any sort of substance that takes us out of that realm of really knowing what it is that we're supposed to do. So we've got all of this at our fingertips in terms of the knowledge. Again, Master Shantideva doesn't spend a whole lot of time going into the lower scope teachings, the small scope teachings on karma and all that, but we've seen all of that. Every one of you, I'm sure, has seen teachings in terms of what to adopt, what to discard and abandon, the 10 non-virtues and the 10 virtues, as well as all the other deeds that we're talking about in the Bodhisattva path in this text. So if we don't use this life, having gotten that knowledge to fulfill our deepest wish for ourselves and others, then this will really have been an incredible waste. So it's appropriate, as this section is called, for us to abandon negativity and to practice virtue. We'll go back to the slides again and continue with the next verse, remainder of that verse 27, which is in a second outline called, "It is appropriate to contemplate the cause of ignorance." So Master Shantideva says, even I do not know what confused me. What does that mean? This is kind of an interesting sort of query. Like, how did I get so messed up? How did I get so confused? What is it that's causing me not to see what it is that I'm really supposed to do here? And of course, Gyaltsab gives the answer. He says, I also do not know due to which cause I got confused and thus deceived. What cause for confusion is lurking inside me? I think there definitely is something. So, we do have causes of confusion within ourselves. No doubt the biggest force is our own being confused since beginningless time. We've maybe had moments where we've had a bit more clarity, where we've run into the Dharma teachings and had some idea of what we're here to do and how we are to practice in the world and how to get the results that we seek through understanding karma and so on. But there's something obviously lurking inside us that keeps us in this confused state. So this is a good question to sort of ask ourselves occasionally, is to, why do I have such confusion? How can I continue to overcome that confusion? My teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, when he taught on this, when this was taught in the basic program in Italy, which I didn't attend, that was after the master's program, he says, it often happens that when we study meditate, and so forth, we easily become tired. But when talking, gossiping, and criticizing others, even for 3 or 4 hours, we do not become tired. We must recognize this and avoid cheating ourselves. So he's kind of speaking to this whole idea that we do become confused, and we have such enthusiasm sometimes for what is not Dharma, but we lack the enthusiasm for Dharma. So these verses in this whole chapter is to help us to have that degree of conscientiousness and attention to our virtuous deeds. So that concludes the second of the three topics within being conscientious in the trainings. We first looked at abandoning faults, getting rid of our misdeeds as best as we can. And now the advice to turn to the opposite that we just looked at, to move to virtue so that we can accomplish a good rebirth, have all the conditions that we need, even, use this life if we can for liberation and enlightenment. Now we go into the main topic that will cover the remainder of this chapter, conscientiously abandoning the afflictions. This, in turn, has three main outlines, and we'll see sub-outlines within those. The very first outline is contemplating the faults of the afflictions. Of course, now the afflictions, the delusions, let me actually take it off screen and talk a little bit about the afflictions. Most of you know afflictions, negative emotions, delusions, various names for these. The Tibetan is nyomong, and as I understand it, it means that which afflicts the mind. So the afflictions, this is a word that we use in English because that is a property of them. They afflict, they torment our minds. They actually keep our minds from being peaceful. They make us disturbed at that point. We can even call them disturbing emotions. This is another name for them at times. But the word delusion also is used frequently, and that's really a quite useful one. Venerable Rabina, when she teaches on the delusions, she says, every one of these is a big fat lie. It's not telling us the truth. And of course, this speaks to why we can abandon the afflictions, is because they're not in accord with reality. They're not giving us an accurate view of how things actually are at a conventional level, usually, and also even at the deeper, more ultimate level. Because of the wisdom of our lacking the wisdom of emptiness, our being under the sway of our ignorance, we're not even seeing things correctly at that level. But at the conventional level, we aren't even looking at things correctly. In the conventional level, if we talk about a mind of hatred, for example, if we have a mind of hatred or strong dislike towards someone on the basis of something they said or did, we're taking that person and we're painting that over the entire person, so that that is all that we can see. We only see the negative qualities, those negative tendencies. We don't have any room in our view for them to be seen in a positive light, to see their compassion or their love or their care and concern for other beings and so on. So when the mind of hatred or animosity is present, it is totally taking a snapshot of that person on the basis of that negative trait that they've demonstrated and what they did, and making that the sum total of who they are. And to prove that that's inaccurate, I always point out to each of us, well, what has it been like when you were the person who was perceived in that way? Say you did something that somebody didn't like. You got the parking spot before them and they started yelling at you, and you yelled right back and said, forget it. I don't really care about you, whatever. You said something maybe worse than that. But the idea is that at that time when you were being perceived by that person, and they were seeing you through the lens of hatred and anger and animosity, is that an accurate view of you? Is that the sum total of who you are? So we know that in the case of the mind of anger, it's not correct. It's not getting the big picture. It's not taking into consideration everything. And that's just on a conventional level. In terms of a more ultimate level, the deeper level, because we are clinging to this sense of I that doesn't exist, and we are projecting on the other person a level of existence that isn't in accord with reality, this whole thing is faulty. It's not in line with the deeper truth, the deeper understanding of reality that we'll eventually get to when we study chapter 9 on the perfection of wisdom of this text. So we've all had teachings around the delusions and have some understanding of them, but they're the real enemy. And this is what Master Shantideva is trying to get across in this whole section, is that we have to understand that these are very important for us to address. Even, as I said earlier, as bodhisattvas, they're not the main target, because we want to attain enlightenment and remove the knowledge obscurations, but there's no way we can get to removing those without having removed the afflictions, the delusions, these disturbing negative emotions that are troubling us at this time. So let's see what goes on in terms of the outlines then. As I said, the first one was contemplating the faults of these afflictions, and there's quite a few verses for this. And within this, we have 3 sub-outlines. So the very first outline of those sub-outlines is contemplating how the afflictions harm oneself. In this case, I am giving you the sub-outlines that are underneath the sub-outlines. So this goes down into 4 more outlines around how you yourself are being harmed. Sometimes this is an important place for us to start. Like if you go to the doctor and the doctor talks about, say you're a smoker or something, and the doctor talks about how the smoking is affecting other people, the people that you live with and so on, you may not have as much of a concern for that as being told that you have to, are going to face some consequences of that, that your own health is going to be damaged by virtue of that. So the very first topic is to look at how they harm you. First of all, of these 4 outlines, they take away your freedom. So this is a verse too that I think is famous from this chapter. Since me, such craving have neither arms nor legs, and how have I been used like a slave by them? It's a very beautiful verse in terms of the sentiment and really getting at this idea that, these afflictions, they're just states of mind. They don't have any kind of, power behind them. They don't have bodies that are really muscular and able to do all these, amazing things. They're not courageous. They're not clever in any way. They're just inhabiting our minds. So Gyaltsab says, this is page 19 now of the commentary from Gyaltsab, says, my enemies of anger, craving, and so forth, which are contained in the root and associated afflictions, do not have legs, arms, or weapons in their hands, and they are not very brave with great effort, nor are they wise with skillful means. So how did they take away my freedom and make me their slave? And we begin to see that this is what's really going on, that we are under the control of these disturbing factors. The second outline within this idea of how they harm yourself is that they generate boundless suffering. And of course, this is because we give them the space to do this. We don't question them at all. We don't take the time to kind of say, what are you doing in my mind and how do I get rid of you? So verse 29, there's a few verses for this, says, while they dwell within my mind, at their pleasure they cause me harm. Yet I patiently endure them without any anger. This is an inappropriate state, and patience is a contemptible state. So normally, we're going to get to this when we get to chapter 6. Chapter 6 teaches that we should be practicing patience and that we should be avoiding any type of anger. Well, in this case, when we talk about the afflictions, we should have kind of the force of anger behind them, not the delusion of anger, but the force of anger that's like, okay, I'm fed up with these delusions, these afflictions. I need to get rid of them. Another analogy that Venerable Rabina uses, which I find really useful, she calls the afflictions, your crazy roommates. You've got a lot of different roommates. You've got some roommates that are very sane and that are worth having around because it's roommates like compassion and love and patience and so on. But you have a lot of roommates that are not so good to have around. They only lead us down a path that's going to lead to future suffering for ourselves, even tormenting us in the moment. So the idea here is that we have to have this force of anger that's had enough with these afflictions, that is not kind of patient with them, tolerant of them, allowing them to hang out with us, allowing them to take over and be in charge of what we do. So we have to have that type of mind with regard to it. Patience is not a good state in regard to the afflictions. We don't want to be patient with them. So I'll read a bit of what Gyaltsab says here. He says, to practice patience with regard to those that joyfully create the sufferings of the lower realms whilst they abide in my mind is unsuitable. This practice is an object of criticism, and one should regard the afflictions as enemies and strive to abandon them. So as I said earlier, we have to see the afflictions as the real enemy. And we often have people outside of our, in the external world that we call our enemies or the challenging, difficult people in our lives. but they're not the real enemy. The real enemy is the mind of anger that gets upset at the things they do and say. Of course, minds that we want to cultivate in response to that are loving kindness and compassion, care and concern, patience, and so on. All of this will lead to a much more positive result. But if we continue to follow these minds that are our enemy, then we're only going to create suffering for ourselves as well as other beings. And then there's an interesting little comment right after that, and this is still on page 19 of Gyaltsab. He says, one should work at understanding the definitions, the divisions, the causes, and the functions of the afflictions as they are explained in the knowledge treatises, which is the Abhidharma kind of text. Manifest knowledge is what it sometimes is translated to in the English. There's the Abhidharma Kosha, which is the lower school exploration of knowledge, which is written mostly by Vasubandhu, that text. Then you have the Abhidharma Samuccaya, which is the higher knowledge, the higher manifest knowledge of the Mahayana, which is written by his brother Asanga. And he says, and then once you have investigated all of those, you can spend your time meditating on their disadvantages, really see that the afflictions are not our friends, that the afflictions only lead us astray. Now, the way that we traditionally study those mental factors and so on is through the course that we have in the basic program. Another course right now, I believe my dear friend Emily Sue is teaching this out in San Francisco online, and people can join in for that. Might contact Sei Chen Ling in San Francisco if you're interested in attending those courses. But the idea is that there's a structure that is set out, especially with regard to these minds and mental factors. This is what we might call Buddhist psychology, where they go through every one of these different states of mind. Of course, it's not exhaustive in terms of all the possible states of mind, but it highlights the main ones, the ones that we need to know inside and out. They spend a fair amount of time in that course on the 6 root afflictions, which includes the 3 root afflictions that we often talk about of ignorance, attachment, and anger or aversion. And then also includes, besides that, the 3 others, which are the incorrect views, the faulty views that we have, afflicted views, the doubt that is afflicted that we can have, as well as pride. Those are the 6 main ones. And then there are 20 secondary, or sort of, what was the word that was used here? The what I was reading from earlier. Anyway, the associated ones, the ones that are kind of not directly a root, but they come from the root ones. And these would be things like spite and belligerence and non-conscientiousness and what have you. There's various non-virtuous states of mind that can come from the 3 root delusions. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there as something that is well worth investigating, and we're being told by Master Shantideva here that it is important for us to have some awareness of these delusions. And Gyaltsab says that we should definitely understand them as they are explained in these sorts of texts, and then meditate on their disadvantages, meditate on the fact that they aren't our friends. And I've been teaching on anger at the uh, center up in Taos every week. And there was one passage in there from Venerable Thupten Chodron's book called Working with Anger that some of you may have read, where she talks about how anger, when it comes into our mind, appears to be a protector. It appears to be something that is there to help us at that point, at that juncture, when we're actually experiencing someone that's belittling us or saying whatever to us, doing whatever to us. And it's not a protector at all. That's a delusion again, that it's not in your best interest to follow the mind of anger and retaliate or seek revenge, whatever, towards the people who are harming you, try to harm them back when they harm you, all of that. So we get fooled by that. We think that these delusions are protectors for us. We have to see their drawbacks. We have to see their disadvantages. If we really understand what they do to our minds, even the mind of attachment, desire, that seems to be our friend as well, that we'd love to follow, just mindlessly following, whatever, like junkies born into a world of junk, as Venerable Rabina says, just going after all the various things in our life. This is not healthy. This is not a good state for us to be in. And of course, we end up wasting this life, as we're seeing in this text. So the very next verse, continuing with this for a little bit longer, we'll do about another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll take a short break and see if there are any questions before we go on. Verse 30 continues in this same topic of the fact that these afflictions generate boundless suffering. Shantideva says, Should even all the gods and antigods or demigods rise up against me as my enemies, they cannot lead me to nor place me in the fires of relentless torment. So all of these beings, and if we look at the beings in our world, not gods and demigods, but the beings of um, uh, the human world, or animals even for that matter, even if they come up against you as your enemies, even if they try to harm you in whatever way, the most they can take away from you is this life, right? They can't place you in a state of unbelievable hell, hellish existence, relentless torment, again being the worst of these hot hells. They can't do that. The only thing that will do that is your own mind. We continue then with this next verse that says that. But this foe, the powerful afflictions, in an instant can cast me there, which when met with which when met will cause not even the ashes of Mount Meru to remain. So again, if we meet that hell of unrelenting torment, at that instant, we will be cast there by virtue of our own powerful afflictions, and not even the ashes of Mount Meru remain in the force of that great, hot hell that we are abiding in. So let me read what Gyaltsab says on this. He says, even if all the gods and demigods arise as my enemies, if I do not fall under the control of the mental afflictions, then they are not able to guide and place me into the fire without respite. But this powerful enemy of the afflictions in my continuum throws me in an instant into the fire without respite, where even the ashes of Mount Meru do not remain upon contact. Therefore, he says, Gyaltsab, one should strive to destroy the enemy of the afflictions. So I found one little bit of advice. This is on your book list as well, the No Time to Lose, which has been republished as Becoming Bodhisattvas, I think, by Pema Chodron. And she's always such a, I don't know, down-to-earth teacher for me. I enjoy reading her teachings very much. And this commentary on 9 of the 10 chapters of Shantideva is really quite useful, I think. This is on page 92 of this, and it's right about in the center of the page. She says, do not, however, which I find this is really be sweet advice, do not, however, underestimate the healing power of self-reflection. For example, when you're about to say a mean word or indulge in self-righteousness or criticism, just reflect on the spot. If I strengthen this habit, will it bring suffering or relief? I think this is a really useful advice. When we're kind of under the sway and beginning to feel the delusions coming in, to ask that simple question, following this, is it going to bring me suffering or is it going to bring me relief? And we may still have some confusion, some delusion in our minds where we think that somehow we are going to find relief by getting angry at that person who has angered us. But if we really examine it and know the teachings well, we know that that's not the answer to that question. If we follow the mind of anger, it's not going to bring any relief. It's only going to torment our own minds. I mean, look at how many times we've done that and we've gotten angry, upset at somebody, and then we've had such regret for it later that it's so hard to shake it off. And we might even, if it's a dear, person in our lives, we may have damaged that relationship beyond being able to reconcile again. So there's generally regret and remorse after having these minds of anger in most of us. So we know that this isn't a good pathway. It's not going to bring peace to our minds. It's only going to bring more torment, even if we don't talk about the consequences karmically, even if we don't talk about these hells of unrelenting torment and what have you. We can simply look at it from the point of view of which is a better state of mind to be in. What would we rather look back on and feel good about ourselves, with which state of mind? The mind that was patient and tolerant in the face of that angry person, or the mind that was belligerent and awful and saying things that we regret later? So this is, I think, very good advice for us to follow, is to really be conscientious in that way, to understand that these enemies that we have within our own minds are the source of all of our suffering. All of our happiness, all of our suffering arises from our own minds. This is the fundamental truth of all of Buddhism, as all of you know. So let's go on then for just a little bit longer and do some additional verses. We now get into the third outline within this first idea under the faults of the afflictions, which is about how the afflictions harm you. So the third outline says they harm over an infinite amount of time. It's not just like an instant that you experience that, but we can see that they have ramifications for a great length of time. So in verse 32, which is the only verse for this outline, Master Shantideva says, all other enemies are incapable of such a length of time as can my afflictions, the long time enemy with neither beginning nor end. So an enemy in this life who could manifest, someone who doesn't like you, who could make your life kind of miserable for even a number of years, that's nothing compared to the amount of time that the afflictions have been making your existence in samsara miserable. So Gyaltsab says, another drawback of the afflictions to contemplate, no other worldly enemy has such an ability to live for a long time like the enemy of the afflictions, who abide for extensive time without beginning or end. So once more, we don't find that the beings in this world live long enough to continue to harm us. Eventually we will die or they will die, and that suffering of being under the sway of what they're doing in our lives is gone. But we will still be under the sway of the afflictions. And certainly if we haven't done anything to combat the afflictions in our interactions with those enemies, then we will most definitely continue to experience the harm from our inner enemies. It's at this point that Gyaltsab, in this is page 20 of the commentary on verse 32, he says, since meditating on the antidote to the afflictions only for one session does not do anything, one should strive to have an uninterrupted stream of effort in destroying the afflictions. So I thought at this point it would be useful to touch on just a few of the antidotes to the afflictions briefly. Most of you, again, have had some exposure to this and have seen the teachings on this. They're generally taught in the Lamrim, the stages of the path, in the middle scope, the person of middling capacity, because it's at that level that we begin our work on the afflictions, having developed the mind of renunciation and the desire to move away from our habitual patterns that keep us bound up in samsara. We determine to overcome the afflictions. The overcoming the afflictions is a process. It's not a switch we can flip and suddenly we can, no longer have afflictions in our mind. We have to begin in a very gradual way. And sometimes the initial steps might be simply to not be in contact with what causes you the afflictions to arise. So if this is similar advice they give to alcoholics or people who are in substance abuse programs where they're trying to break that habit. They've come to some conclusion that they want to move in that direction. Well, the first advice is don't hang around the objects that stimulate that addictive craving. So it's the same for us in the world. If we don't, the initial step might be, I need to remove myself from the force of that so that I can develop more ability in my mind, so I can eventually be in the presence of those objects and not have my mind go out of control. But if we don't take some time to do that, and of course do the work on our cushion, then we never get to the next step. The next step is to do what are called the temporal antidotes, the antidotes in the moment that are generally directed at specific delusions or afflictions because they have a unique way of presenting it. So the most common ones in terms of the mind of attachment, let's talk about that one first, recalling that attachment is that mind of kind of craving desire that has a pleasant experience with an object and wishes to kind of not be separated from it, to pull it into our experience and continue to have that. And of course, it's exaggerating the positive qualities of that object and is like that sort of junkie mentality that goes grasping at all these various pleasurable objects in our life. Well, the main antidote, they say, is to see the unpleasant aspects of that object. When the mind of attachment is present, it's painting the entire thing as pleasant. The mind of attachment is a delusion in that way because it's not seeing what is undesirable about that object. So if we have strong craving attachment to various sense objects and what have you, we need to have a more balanced view of them. We need to not see them purely through the lens of attachment, which is faulty. It's not taking everything into consideration. That begins to lessen the attachment that we have. Of course, the classic example that's taught in terms of attachment and seeing the undesirable qualities of the object of attachment is in chapter 8 of this text that we also will eventually get to, I hope. And that will be towards the beginning of that, he talks about meditating on the undesirable qualities of a body that we are attached to. Of course, he was teaching an audience of monks, so he talks about a woman's body. And it's not meant to be a gender thing. It's meant to be that showing the reality that all bodies have these same qualities. And if we look at a body, and it may appear very seductive to us, very beautiful to us, and we have that kind of view of someone's body in that light, but what we are getting attracted to is just the surface of the body. It's just the skin that covers the body. If you were to take off, just the tiniest bit of that skin and expose what is right underneath the skin, you would be repulsed by the body. You wouldn't get into bed with that body. You wouldn't do anything with that body that the mind of desire and attachment is leading you to do when you aren't seeing that. Now, again, it's not to drive you to a point where you have repulsion for everybody and you kind of walk around thinking that everybody's this gross, being filled with all these unpure substances and what have you. Rather, the idea is that you have a more balanced view. You recognize that where you do have attachment, it's only seeing one aspect. It's not seeing the entirety of it. And another antidote sometimes for attachment, but it can also be used for some of the other delusions, is to recognize the impermanence of things. All the objects that we are attached to. Master Shantideva had that verse back in chapter 3, right, where he was saying, that we are going to have to eventually leave behind all these objects of our life that we're attracted to. All the attachments we have in our life, it's impermanent. They don't last. Sometimes they cease within this life, but definitely at the end of this life, we have to let them go. So this is, again, something that we can bring into our contemplation to diminish the strong mind of attachment that is clinging to that pleasurable appearance and not seeing a balanced view of things. On the other hand, the temporal antidote for the mind of hatred, which is a kind of a development of anger, aversion, energy, when we get to that place where we really hate somebody, is to generate the thoughts of loving kindness. So as I said, when we have a negative mind like hatred or anger, we're only seeing the negative qualities and we're painting the person entirely that way. But that person, no matter what horrible things they've done to us or to others, is still a suffering being who simply wants to be happy, who doesn't want to suffer, just very misguided in how they're going about doing that. So the mind of loving kindness towards them, the mind that wishes for them to be happy, as well as the accompanying mind of compassion that wishes for them to not suffer, is a more valid state of mind. It helps us to not be so focused on the negative aspects and have hatred towards that being. So these are the two that are classically shown in terms of the two other of the three root delusions, attachment and anger or hatred. But there are many other ones that can be taught that kind of help us to diminish them. For example, we can look even at the disadvantages of these afflictions, a bit of what we're looking at now in the text. And that may already lessen some of our practice of them. That when we see that attachment doesn't lead to any definite result, that it's like drinking salt water to quench our thirst, then that may be a way to diminish it. Or when we even see that the things that are unpleasant in our lives don't last. If you can recall some of the difficult experiences you've had in this life with people or situations and so on, we know that those aren't lasting now. We still have a memory of them, but they aren't going on right now. Our mind is much calmer now. We're not in that state of agitation. So we can see impermanence also plays a role, and the disadvantages of these afflictions. So we've got different antidotes that we can apply at different times. The ultimate antidote is what we're driving for in the end. So we start off with maybe a first line of defense of kind of getting that object maybe out of our sphere of awareness so that we don't have that strong reaction initially. But then hopefully we can be with that object, but we practice a temporal antidote. Eventually we can practice the ultimate antidote. And the ultimate antidote is the wisdom of emptiness, where we see that we ourselves, the being or whatever is the object of that's involved at that time, also is empty of inherent existence, that the act that we are engaged in is empty of inherent existence, that there is nothing that is real in the way that we think things are real. And again, that's a much deeper teaching that we'll get into when we get to chapter 9. But just know that this way of working with the afflictions, as it's said here by Gyaltsab Je, that doing this only for one session doesn't have a big impact. But if we continue to work with these thoughts, that's why I always encourage people to bring what happened in your day into your evening meditation if you can, or your next morning meditation, whatever the case might be, and say you had a difficult exchange with somebody. Well, then think through what would have been healthier thoughts to have. How would I reframe that now within my knowledge of the Dharma to have an antidote to that mind of anger or jealousy or pride or whatever it was that manifested? That's an important part of our practice. If we don't spend that time investigating those, we're never going to make a dent in the afflictions. So we'll do just one more verse before we take a short break, and that's the final verse of this section in the fourth outline. The fourth outline is why it's unsuitable to befriend the afflictions. I mean, why it's not to cozy up to the afflictions and make them seem like they're our best friend. So this is verse 33. Shantideva says, if I agreeably honor and rely upon others, all will enact benefit and happiness. But if I rely upon these afflictions, in return, I will be harmed by suffering. So in our ordinary world, right, if you treat even your worst enemies kindly, frequently they will enact your benefit over time. They will come to have a different relationship with you. But these enemies in our own minds are not like the external enemies that can be kind of changed by virtue of our being kind to them and taking care of them and so on. If we are kind to the afflictions and allow them to take root and live rent-free in our own minds, well then they're only going to harm us. They're going to be the crazy roommates that don't enact our welfare. They actually make our life much more difficult. So on the top of page 21 of Gyaltsab Je's commentary, he says, when one relies on the outer enemy after having honored them agreeably by serving them food, drink, and so forth, then they will benefit us and help us to have happiness. But if we rely on the enemy of the afflictions and act agreeably to them, then they will increase in strength, retaliate, and cause us harm. To destroy them is the only method to attain happiness. So, we don't want to destroy our external enemies because the external enemies aren't the real source of it. We saw that earlier. And we don't want to befriend our internal enemies. The internal enemies are the problem. So we have to destroy the internal enemies. And of course, befriend, if we can, the external enemies. But understand that all the causes of our suffering are coming from our own deluded minds, our own crazy minds. So let's take a short break here and see if there are any questions. And as I said last time, if you want to ask a question directly, you can unmute your mic and ask that. If you'd like to put it in the chat box, you can do that. And I can read it from the chat box. But if there aren't any questions, I'll certainly continue on. But anything? Yes, Lynn. Let me make sure that you're unmuted here. Okay. I'm trying to unmute you. There you go.
I have a voice. Thank you, Don.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering when you talk about the four antidotes here, and then in the previous class we talked about the Vajrasattva purification practice. So how would these two work together, which on one hand sounds obvious when I'm asking you that question. On the other hand, I'm just curious what your answer is.
Sure. So again, when we make that determination through the four opponent powers, in our purification practice to refrain from those actions again, we need some force behind that, right? It's one thing to say, okay, I'm not going to use my voice harshly with my friends, again, because maybe that's a problem for us, is that we yell at people, we get out of control with what we're saying. So we want to have the force behind that resolve, that refraining from that action again in the future. Well, we need more than just saying it sometimes. I mean, saying it is a powerful thing, right? To say, I'm not going to do that again. But how do we actually not do that? We have to find something opposite that we need to engage in. So that's where these antidotal minds that we talked about come from. And of course, as I said, right at the very beginning of our practice, we might need to remove ourselves from that. And if we remove ourselves from that, that doesn't mean that we just wait for some time and eventually we'll be able to go back to it. We have to work on our minds in the middle of that, which means I have to meditate and recall that experience and think about that person and try to reframe it in my own mind so that I have some force, so that when I meet that object or person again, it'll be different. I'll actually start to progress in the pathway of being less disturbed by it, being able to be more in control of my mind. So this is a process of meditation. It's a process of working frequently with that. Oftentimes, and even in the Lojong versus the 7-point mind training, one of the slogans is to begin with the greatest affliction. So say that anger is a problem. I keep using anger, but it's obviously one of the most harmful ones. We're going to see all of chapter 6 dedicated to working against anger. If we decide that anger is our worst affliction and it's causing us the most suffering and the people around us the most suffering, well, then we target that one. And every day of our lives, we do some form of meditation on working with anger by applying different thoughts, applying different antidotes, reframing things, trying to have a deeper understanding of what's going on. And then we keep testing it. We keep working with it every day. And then on the cushion, we do our debrief and see how did that work and what do I need to change and what force of thought would help me to get through this and have a better result. And we keep working at it. It's a simple matter of just doing the work. But that's very important in terms of that last opponent power of making the resolve not to do those things again. That's why we often, and what I said when I went through it earlier, I didn't explain it as much, but we often make a resolve to not do it for a manageable period of time. Some
Yeah.
things we can say, I won't do again in this life. I'll never intentionally kill a being. That may be already a lot to ask for, but we might get to a point in our practice where we can say that. But if I can say every day of my life, I will never intentionally say a harmful or cruel word to another person, well, that may be a bit more challenging. So we have to take the steps to say, I will refrain from that for some period of time. But even, as I said earlier, just saying it may not be enough. We need to have some thoughts behind it, that help us to look at things in a very different way and then act according to that, act more virtuous in the face of that stimulus that would normally cause us to get angry and upset. So does that
Yeah.
help a bit then, Lynn?
Yeah, no, that makes it really clear. You're outlining the process so articulately that it's helpful to get it. And that's what breaks down the negative thinking. That
Okay.
it's like breaking it down. And
Okay.
to purify also.
Hmm. Yeah, good. All right. Any other questions? There was one question, and I can certainly send along to people the name of the San Francisco group that's doing the online class with Emily. It's Tse Chen Ling. TSE is the first word, Tse. Tse means compassion, and then Chen, CHEN, means great, and then Ling is like Nam Dro Ling, the study group that's joining this, or Tupten Norbu Ling, my center here in Santa Fe. Ling means land, L-I-N-G means land. So they are land of great compassion. That's actually where I started my FPMT connection in 1996 in San Francisco. So if you go to their website or write to them at their info, I'm sure they can help you with that. And I don't know all the details. The course may have started, and then I'm not sure if it has started. I just don't know all the details. But the plan was for Emily to teach on minds and mental factors. That's what you're looking for, is the course on minds and mental factors. And again, it's a sort of course in Buddhist psychology. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, let's see. We've got just a few more minutes. Let's go ahead and do a few additional slides. I always like to take advantage of what time we have, and we'll end on time tonight. But the very next outline is the second outline under contemplating the faults of the affliction. So the first one was seeing how let me get back up here, how the afflictions harm oneself. Now we look at how it is unsuitable to meditate on patience for the afflictions. We were kind of already touching on this topic a little bit with the previous verses. There are two outlines within this, and it's just a couple of verses. The first outline is contemplating the way that the afflictions harm the mind. The second outline will be how they harm the body, but let's look at how they harm the mind. While in cyclic existence, how can I be joyful and unafraid if in my heart I certainly prepare a place for this incessant enemy of long duration, the sole cause for the increase of collections of harms? So the idea here is that, if we're going to continue to give space, as I think it's Venerable Pema Chodron says, safe lodging, give them a room in your being for them to abide, for them to continue to be there, give them a place. And you're making room for the worst enemy that you can imagine that is going to be around for a long time and has been around a long time. Well, this is what's been causing all of our problems. How can we possibly be joyful and unafraid? How can we possibly have a positive state of mind in the face of this? So Gyaltsab says, therefore, if this continual long-time enemy, who is the singular, unrivaled cause for the strong increase of the accumulation of all harm, takes up permanent residence in my heart, then how can psychic existence be free and joyful? Tupten Chodron Venerable Pema Chodron in No Time to Lose says, if we give safe lodging to neurosis, then how can we expect it to result in joy? If we give rein to our delusions, we're crazy to think that somehow we're going to have a joyful life, somehow samsara is going to improve in any way. Again, getting samsara to improve is never the result anyway, but the conclusion at Gyaltsab commentary says, since there's no chance for happiness, if we do that, strive in destroying the afflictions, kind of giving us that message once again. The second outline, as I said, is contemplating how they harm the body, so they're suitable to be patient with them, to give them room in our being. Verse 35 says, how shall I ever have happiness if in a net of attachment within my mind there dwell the guardians of the prison of psychic existence, who become the slayers, who kill me in hell, and so forth? This gets into these verses, and we do see these references occasionally in Shantideva's texts where he talks about the guardians of the hell realms and so on. All the states of existence we were talking about earlier, even our human existence, everything is karmically created. Everything is a product of our own past actions. So what's being said in this is that, if this is really the guardian of our experience in psychic existence, who becomes these torturers and hell realms and so on, if that's abiding within our own minds due to our own attachment, our own inappropriate attention to things, our mistaken conceptions about things, well then how will we have happiness? It's going to even torment our bodies in terms of the experiences we will have in these various realms that arise from letting the afflictions, take residence in our own minds. So just to conclude this part, Gyaltsab on page 21 at the bottom says, these afflictions do not grant freedom from cyclic existence. Rather, they become the guardians of the prison of cyclic existence. They also become the executioners, killing in both the upper and the lower realms. Again, we will see a reference to these guardians coming up in the chapter on patience as well. But as I mentioned, they're frequently used as kind of the ramifications of our minds of anger, of our minds of the delusions that we actually manifest in those states with beings that torture us, that give us great harm. Gyaltsab continues, he says, if these afflictions abide within the net of the mistaken conceptions, within the net of attachment in my mind, then how can one have a chance for happiness? There is no chance for mental or physical happiness, which was, again, both of those verses kind of looking at that idea. So I think that's probably good enough for tonight, is the idea that, again, we're really trying to combat the afflictions in this section. Next week, I'm sorry, not next week, because we don't have a class next week, nor the week after. I mentioned this at the beginning of tonight. The 2 next Mondays, I'll be occupied with other things. And so the next class will actually be on Monday, March 16th. So we'll continue the text then. But we'll conclude this section where we look at the third of these points, where we generate the courage to destroy the afflictions. This is all under the main topic that we've been working with, of the faults of the afflictions. And we see the problems that they cause us. Sometimes, as I said, that may be enough of an impetus for us to really address them. If I used a doctor analogy earlier, but if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, if you keep eating this food or being in this situation, doing this various activity, you're going to cause harm to yourself. Well, sometimes that's enough for us to say, okay, I need to rectify things. As hard as it might be to change our habits, we need to move in a different direction. Well, this is a pretty big one. This isn't just this life and the suffering of this life or the length of this life. This is our continuing to be in this state of samsara, and moreover, because this is a bodhisattva text, our inability to help other beings, because we're still under the control of our own afflictions. So those are the thoughts that maybe take away from this. And as usual, I encourage you to do some meditation on these verses. Maybe spend some time with each of these and reflect on them. You can look back on the commentaries that we're using, as well as some of the other ones that are on your text list if you'd like to, and just try to make them, very prominent in your mind, and we'll continue our exploration in a few weeks. At some point, I will send out the sort of quiz stuff for chapter 4. I think I might wait till the end of chapter 4. We're not that far from the end of chapter 4 now. I'm pretty sure we'll finish it in the next class. But just know that those are just another tool that you can use to review this material and to find a way to work with it outside of the teachings. So let's go ahead and do our prayers to dedicate. If you have the prayer book in front of you, we're going to go to page 5, where we have the recitations after teachings, the general dedication prayers that we do there on that page. So once more, if you don't have the prayer book, you can certainly just listen to these and develop the same thoughts. And let's dedicate with these prayers now. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we go to page 6, and we have these 2 prayers for His Holiness and Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Maybe we can even think about today. Today is Losar, and we generally try to commemorate Lama Yeshe, the founder of our organization, so we can also have strong intentions for the good health and long life of Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, as well as all of the Lamas, all of those guiding us in our own lives and in the lives of others, as well as all spiritual guides in whatever tradition, so that they can all have good health and long lives, and we and others can always have perfect guides in our lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then finally, I always encourage people to do personal dedications in your own heart, the beings that whose situation moves you at this time. You may have beings who you know who have experienced obstacles or experiencing them now, beings who have illness, who have died, or who may even be dying at this time. Whoever it is whose suffering moves you, send this positive energy out to them. Make that very personal connection with them by offering all the merit that you've accumulated for their welfare, for them to be free from suffering immediately, and to also find all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. And through our efforts here tonight, may all beings have perfect causes for complete happiness and attain that state as quickly as possible. Okay, thank you all so much. I really appreciate everyone's participation today, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Keep in mind, these are very virtuous days for practice, from Losar today all the way through Day of Miracles, 2 weeks from today, March 9th. Very important days to practice virtue as much as possible. So do a good job at doing that and avoiding non-virtue, and I'll see you in 3 weeks then, I guess. Yeah. Okay, bye-bye.